Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Palestine Chronicle TV. We are joined today by a very special guest, Professor Noam Chomsky, renowned intellectual, linguist, author, Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT. Professor Chomsky has written extensively about the Palestinian cause for decades, in addition, of course, to numerous other subjects, including linguistics, politics, geopolitics, human rights, and mass media. After Israel's war on Gaza in 2014, Chomsky co authored the book On Palestine with renowned historian Professor Ilan Pappé. Among his many other books, he also authored Peace in the Middle East, Reflections on Justice and Nationhood, The Fateful Triangle, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, and Gaza in Crisis, Reflections on Israel's War Against the Palestinians, also co-authored with Professor Pape. Professor Chomsky, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time from your very busy schedule to join us, and welcome to the show. In a lecture in October 2014, at the United Nations, you stated that, quote, the United States government should first and foremost comply with United States legislations. The so-called Leahy Law, for example, prohibited the United States from providing weapons to any foreign military units that consistently committed human rights violations. The Israeli army, and this is still your quote, was committing massive human rights violations, and consequently, the provisions of arms to Israel by the United States violated United States law. Professor Chomsky, how realistic do you think it would be to expect a major shift in US foreign policy regarding Washington's military and financial support to Israel? In other words, do you feel that there are margins within the current US foreign policy agenda to alter Washington's attitude towards Israel and Palestine?
That there is a relation between US government policy and human rights, and it has been investigated in great detail. The basic principle is that the greater the violation of human rights, the more the US gives support and aid to it. Almost exactly the opposite of what's commonly claimed, but it's quite easy to demonstrate. Take just today, by far the most US foreign aid, incomparably more than anyone else, goes to one of the worst human rights violators in the world, state of Israel. It's the only state that has carried out illegal, brutal occupation, 70 years, violation of Security Council orders. It's even annexed foreign territory in violation of explicit Security Council orders. I don't have to run through the harsh and brutal nature of the occupation, but that's ranks high among global human rights violators. It's alone in these respects. Actually, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as you know, are very conservative organizations, recently simply recognized it as the world's only apartheid state. So it certainly ranks high by any measure. And it's just out of sight as far as US aid goes. Well, the second highest recipient of US aid is Egypt. That's actually connected to the aid in Israel by law. Egypt now is under the harshest, most brutal dictatorship of its ugly history. Some 60,000 people in prison, dissenting torture. One of them, Abu Futo, I met a couple of years ago, been in prison for years, an honest dissident, tortured, isolated, and there's case after case. And it's a horrible situation. So that's the second highest recipient of U.S. aid. If you look at U.S. military aid, it's even more clear. You go through the years, the leading recipient of U.S. military aid has usually been the most severe human rights violator. So in the 1990s, when Turkey was carrying out horrendous atrocities against its own Kurdish population, tens of thousands of people killed, thousands of towns and villages destroyed, every imaginable kind of terror, of torture and ill treatment, hundreds of thousands of people driven from their homes to miserable slums in Istanbul. I visited them there. Was the highest recipient of U.S. aid. Before that, it replaced Colombia, which had been the leading human rights violator, highest recipient of U.S. aid. Before that, it was El Salvador, which was slaughtering its own citizens with U.S. aid. And in fact, as the late Edward Herman and I showed years ago back in the 1970s, if you looked at the Amnesty International record of torture and compared it worldwide, compared it with U.S. aid, they're very closely correlated. So, okay, that's the general point. With regard to U.S. law, there's a very interesting situation, which in the tightly controlled doctrinal system of the United States, you're not allowed to discuss. The United States is a pretty free country, so when I talk about it, I'm not thrown into jail. You're allowed to talk about it as long as nobody hears what you're saying. So I'll do that again. Supposedly, according to the United States, one of the greatest threats to world peace is Iranian nuclear programs. The United States pulled out of the agreement on nuclear programs in violation of Security Council orders. It then turned to punishing Iran for US withdrawal from the agreement, very harsh sanctions. Now Iran is reacting. It's not allowing observers, international observers, to see its programs, where Israel's continuing with its policies of assassination and sabotage. So Israel has unique rights in the world, thanks to US support. It's allowed to assassinate scientists, blow up installments, basically anything it wants. And it's brazen, so it goes ahead and do it. And there's then come Iranian reactions and threats to Israeli scientists in Turkey, much outrage about that, and constant threat of moving on to a general war. Well, is there a solution to this problem? Yes, very simple one. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East with inspections, which work. American intelligence agreed that the inspections under the joint agreement worked very well, so no problem. So what's stopping it? Is anybody opposed? Not Iran. Iran is strongly in favor of it. Not the Arab states. In fact, they initiated this demand 30 years ago and have been insisting on it ever since. Not the global South. They're all strongly in favor of it. No objections from Europe. So what's the problem? Washington. Every time the issue comes up in an international forum, the US vetoes it, including Obama. No report about this. This just happens. Why does the US veto it? Everybody knows, but nobody's allowed to say. It's obvious. If there is a nuclear weapons-free zone, Israel's huge nuclear weapons arsenal will have to be inspected. The US won't allow that. In fact, the US does not officially acknowledge their existence. Everyone knows they have it, but you can't acknowledge it. Why? Now we're back to US law. US law has provisions like the Symington Amendment, a couple of others, that make it arguably illegal for the United States to send any military aid, or maybe any aid at all, to Israel because of its violation of the international regime on nuclear weapons. Well, neither political party wants to open that door. Press won't report it. In fact, it's kind of interesting to watch how they try to evade it. So, for example, the New York weapons-free zone for the Persian Gulf region, excluding Israel. The only nuclear weapon state has to be excluded. And they said, why? They said, this is non-negotiable. Okay, so we can't discuss it. That's the closest anyone has come in the public even to acknowledge the possibility. So we race on to a possible war because we have to protect probably arguably illegal US aid to Israel. Now, there are other provisions. There's what's called the Leahy Law, Patrick Leahy, which bans US military aid to any military unit which is engaged in systematic human rights violations. Well, the IDF is Israeli army is up to its neck in consistent human rights violations, not even a question. So aid to Israel is banned under US law. It's kind of interesting and important that right now it's finally becoming possible to bring this issue up and have somebody listen. In fact, there was actually a congressional resolution by Betsy McCollum, Michigan, for banning US aid in violation of the Leahy Law. Didn't get anywhere, of course, barely reported. But the fact that this is becoming an issue on the public agenda is very significant. It's there's a background to this. The background is that US popular attitudes towards Israel and Palestine have been shifting. That's of immense importance. That's in fact the hope for some form of resolution of this horrible oppression of Palestinians. US position is decisive, obviously. You go back a decade or two, support Israel. Israel was the darling of the liberal community in the United States. Liberal intellectuals raved about Israel. The young people went to Israel to see this marvelous, flourishing social democracy, and so on. That was a couple of decades ago. Not now. It's shifted strikingly. Actually, I can see it very well in my own experience. Up until about 15 years ago, if I wanted to give a talk on Israel and Palestine, I literally had to have police protection, even on my own campus. The police insisted on walking me back to my car afterwards. Meetings were broken up violently. It's you had to have airport security for a meeting. Even if I was giving lectures at some university on philosophy lectures, and one of the talks I was giving was on the Middle East, campus police insisted on accompanying me the whole time. That's changed. In fact, you can date the change. The big dramatic change was after Cast Lead, 2008, 2009. The atrocities were so extreme that it really broke through. You saw an enormous change. By now, it's totally different. Give a talk, thousands of people show up, can't get a hostile question. Attitudes have just shifted. Support for Israel today in the United States is from the Christian nationalist evangelical movements and the security-related systems, military and police, far-right ultranationalists, big shift that has not yet led to a change in policy, but it could. And if it does, the whole situation changes. You go back to the 1970s, Israel made a fateful decision. It had a chance for peace at the time, very clearly, had a chance for a peaceful settlement. I could go through the details. Israel thought about it, rejected it. This is incidentally the Labor Party. This is not the right wing. Decided to expand. They chose expansion over security. That entailed full reliance on the United States to protect them. And that means that when the United States lifts its finger, Israel has to obey, has no choices. That's actually happened over and over. Actually, Obama was the first US president not to force Israel to do something it didn't want to do. And of course, Trump just went all out, let them do whatever they want. Biden hasn't changed it. But if US policy changes, even a threat to change, that would change the situation in Israel dramatically. They have no choices. They have to follow US orders. They're trying to get around it in interesting ways with alliances among the most reactionary states in the world. This is hailed in the West as a great achievement, but think about it, like the Abraham Accords. That's an alliance between the most reactionary states in the Middle East, North African region, including Israel, which has drifted far to the right. Well, that's a natural alliance for Israel. You go to Europe, Israel's strongest ally in Europe is Hungary, the outlier in Europe, the so-called illiberal democracy, which is crushing democracy and shares values with Israel. It's racist, exclusivist, wants to crush its minorities. It's violating human civil rights. And Israel and Hungary share a grievance, psychological. Namely, they both feel that they're being unfairly treated by liberal opinion in the West. That's psychological connection. So the relation is close. Relations are developing between Israel and Modi's India, which is dismantling Indian secular democracy, imposing a Hindu ethnocracy, violating civil and human rights, occupied Kashmir, brutally suppressed it, all kind of anti-Muslim legislation, very natural ally of Israel. So there is a kind of reactionary international developing, pretty much run by Washington, where Israel plays a central role. But if opinion changes in the United States and influences policy, that could have a substantial impact.
Very good. Thank you very much for this, Professor Chomsky. Please do allow me to bring in my co-host and the managing editor of the Palestine Chronicle, Romana Rubeo. Romana.
Sorry, I'm not hearing. Oh.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Ramzy, and thank you, Professor Chomsky. It is an honor and a privilege to talk to you tonight. In an interview with Democracy Now! A few years ago, you stated that Israel's actions in Palestine are much worse than apartheid in South Africa. To call it apartheid is a gift to Israel, at least if by apartheid you mean South African style apartheid, you said. What's happening in the occupied territories is much worse. There is a crucial difference. The South African nationalists needed the Black population. That was their workforce. The Israeli relationship to the Palestinians in the occupied territories is totally different. They just don't want them. They want them out or at least in prison. So, Professor Chomsky, this view was also communicated by the late South African anti-apartheid icon, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in 2013. So, could you kindly elaborate on the comparison between the Israeli and the South African apartheid models? And second, do you think it is strategic for Palestinians to link their anti-apartheid struggle to that of South Africa? And would that comparison speed up somehow the international pressure on Israel to eventually hold it accountable?
Okay, small technical problem. The chat is only giving the top part, but I think I understand what you were saying. Actually, yes, I've held for a long time that the occupied territories are much worse than South Africa. It's a gift to Israel to call it apartheid. If you look at the South African situation, which was awful enough, South Africa needed its Black population. It relied on them. The Black population was 85% of the population. It was the workforce. Country couldn't function without that population. And as a result, they tried to make their situation more or less tolerable to the international community. They didn't succeed, but they tried. So the homelands, so-called, the Bantustans, the South Africa tried to make them more or less livable, reasonable, fairly reasonable conditions. They were hoping for international recognition, which they didn't get. I think Israel was maybe the one exception, but that's not true of the Palestinian occupied territories. Israel just wants to get rid of the people, doesn't want them, go somewhere else, and its policies for the last 50 years, not much variation, have been just somehow make life unlivable so you'll go somewhere else. In Gaza, just destroy them. It's over 2 million people now living in hideous conditions, barely survivable. International organizations say they're not likely to even be able to survive in a couple of years. There's 1 million children there who can't drink water. No water to drink. I don't have to go through the details, you know them. Occupied territory, the West Bank, atrocities every day. If you read, there are some fine Israeli journalists like Gidon Levy, Amira Haas, a couple of others, daily reports of one or another atrocity sometimes by settlers, so-called hillside youths, terrorists basically, supported by the army, sometimes the army participating almost daily. Just right now, in fact, the Supreme Court, in an act of brazen illegality, and a judgment that they produced at midnight, presumably hoping nobody would notice it, and basically expelled 1,000 villagers from Masai Yatta region, kicked them out under the pretext of establishing a military zone, which is pure hypocrisy, leaving the Jewish settlers there. And as in other cases, it will be just turned into a Jewish settled area. Perfectly brazen, In fact, the brazenness of Israeli actions is pretty striking. Like after Shirin Abu Akleh was very likely just assassinated by Israeli snipers, the IDF attacked the funeral. You saw this, everybody saw this on television. attacked the funeral, attacked the pallbearers. Gidon Levy wrote a column about it. He didn't pull any punches. He just said the Israeli stormtroopers attacked the funeral. Everybody could see it on television. They didn't care. It was broadcast on, main television channels, but at this point, they simply don't care. Do what they want. The United States will support them. Well, all of that is much worse than what happened in South Africa. It's not an effort to somehow accommodate the Palestinian population as a suppressed workforce. It's just to get rid of them. And in fact, if you look at the Israeli plans of the last 50 years, which are unfortunately ignored in much of the discussion, I should say, as I've said before, much of the discussion of this topic seems to me misplaced. It's mostly a debate between two states and one state that eliminates the most important option, the live option, the one that's being pursued, namely Greater Israel, establishing a Greater Israel in which Israel takes over whatever it wants in the West Bank, crushes Gaza, annexes illegally the Syrian Golan Heights. Nobody even talks about that anymore. Just takes what it wants, avoids the Palestinian population concentrations. So it doesn't incorporate Nablus and Tulkarm. We don't want the Palestinians because of what's called the demographic. So all this pretense that somehow you can have a democratic Jewish state in which the state is the sovereign state of the Jewish people. So my state, but not the state of some Palestinian villager in Yatta, or in Israel for that matter. Well, to maintain that pretense, you have to keep a large Jewish majority. Then you can somehow pretend it's not repressive. So the policy is a Greater Israel in which you won't have any demographic problem. The main concentrations of Palestinians are excluded. In other areas, they're basically being expelled. So in the parts of the West Bank that Israel wants to maintain and integrate within Israel, I think there are by now about 165 enclaves in which Palestinian villagers are surrounded with barbed wire, IDF soldiers who occasionally may let them go out to tend their farms or their herds or their olive groves, but basically just go somewhere else. Let's get rid of it. That's worse than apartheid. And I think it's a gift to Israel to describe it as an apartheid state. Within Israel, it's not as severe as apartheid. But outside of Israel, in the occupied territories, it's considerably worse.
I thank you very much for that, Professor Chomsky. Just to stay in the context of South Africa, in a 2014 Democracy Now! Interview, you argued that the liberation of South Africa was an outcome of both internal and external reasons. For example, the growing isolation of the apartheid regime and the change in the geopolitical scenario. Now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seems that our understanding and discussion on Palestine was largely isolated from any geopolitical component and placed squarely within local dimensions. For example, the peace process, or regional dimensions. For example, US foreign policy and Arab normalization in the Middle East region. Now, Professor Chomsky, do you feel that the geopolitical aspect of the Palestinian struggle for freedom has changed in recent months, especially as a result of the global rift, itself an outcome of the NATO-Russian conflict and the war in Ukraine?
Yes. There are significant changes taking place as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. Basically, what happened is that there's no, first of all, it should be clear, there's no justification for the invasion. It's a criminal invasion. It's on a par with the US invasion of Iraq, Hitler-Stalin invasion of Poland. These are examples of the supreme international crime. You can talk about reasons, provocation, so on, but no justification. That part should be clear. Well, what's the background? The main background is NATO expansion. Just briefly run, and this is not my opinion, it's the opinion of just about every high-level US official in the diplomatic service who has any familiarity with Russia and Eastern Europe. This goes back to George Kennan in the 1990s, Reagan's ambassador, Jack Matlock, a Russian expert in the 90s, including the director of the CIA, including the current director of the CIA. In fact, just about everybody who knows anything has been warning Washington that it is reckless and provocative to ignore Russia's very clear and explicit red lines. Goes back way before Putin, has nothing to do with him. Yeltsin, Gorbachev, the American favorites all said the same thing. Ukraine and Georgia cannot join NATO. That's the geostrategic heartland of Russia. You look at a map, a topographical map, you can see exactly why. You look at the history, also see why. So that's out. Well, what happened? George H.W. Bush, the first one, made an explicit, unambiguous promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand beyond East Germany. Perfectly explicit. There's been a lot of deceit about it. You can look up the documents. It's very clear. Bush lived up to it. He didn't violate it. When Clinton came along, at first he lived up to it, then he started to violate it. And he gave his reasons. He explained to his friend Boris Yeltsin that he just had to do it for domestic political reasons. He had to get the Polish vote, the ethnic vote. So he would let so-called Visegrad countries into NATO. Russia accepted it, didn't like it, but accepted it. His successor, the second George Bush, just threw the doors wide open. In fact, he even invited Ukraine to join over the objections of just about everyone in the top diplomatic service, apart from his own little clique, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and those. But France and Germany vetoed it. But because of US power, it remained on the agenda. And in fact, starting in 2014, after the Maidan uprising, the United States no secret, began moving to integrate Ukraine into the NATO military command, sending heavy armaments, joint military exercises, military training. And not a secret, they boasted about it. In fact, when in 2019, Zelensky was elected on a peace platform, overwhelming mandate. The peace meant what's called Minsk II, some kind of autonomy for the eastern regions. He tried to implement it. He was warned by right-wing militias that if he persisted, they'd kill him. Well, he didn't get any support from the United States. If the United States had supported him, he could have continued we might have avoided all of this. The United States was committed to integration of Ukraine within NATO. Well, Biden came along last September, before the invasion, produced a joint statement. You can read it on the White House webpage, called for expanding these efforts of integration as part of what was called an enhanced program leading to admission of NATO. In November, it was moved forward to called a charter signed by the Secretary of State. Now you go on a couple months to the invasion. The United States Department acknowledged openly that they had not taken Russian security concerns into consideration in any discussions with Russia. Question of NATO admission, they would not discuss. Well, all of that is provocation, not justification, but provocation. And it's kind of interesting that in American discourse now, it's almost obligatory to refer to the invasion as the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. You look it up on Google, you find hundreds, thousands of hits. Well, that's a secret way of acknowledging, of course, it was provoked. Otherwise, you wouldn't refer to it all the time as the unprovoked invasion. So it's not justified, but it's provoked. Well, by now, censorship in the United States has reached such a level beyond anything in my lifetime, such a level that you are not permitted to read the Russian position. Literally, Americans are not allowed to know what the Russians are saying, except selected things. So like if Putin makes a speech to Russians with all kind of outlandish claims about Peter the Great and so on, then you see it on the front pages. If the Russians make an offer for negotiations, can't find it. That's suppressed. You're not allowed to know what they're saying. I've never seen a level of censorship like this. Sort of the same in Europe, not as extreme, but somewhat similar. There's a very simple fact that we have to keep in mind, a trivial truism. The war will end either through diplomacy or not. That's just logic. Well, if diplomacy has a meaning, it means both sides can tolerate it. They don't like it, but they can tolerate it. They don't get everything they want, they get something. That's diplomacy. If you reject diplomacy, you're saying, let's let the war go on with all of its horrors, with all of the destruction of Ukraine, and let's let it go on until we get what we want. Well, what do we want? That's explicit. The United States I'm referring to. What we want, US, is to harm Russia so severely that it will never be able to undertake actions like this again. Well, what does that mean? It's impossible to achieve. So it means let's continue the war until Ukraine is devastated. That's US policy if you stop to think for 30 seconds. But in the current atmosphere of irrationality, if you stop to think for 30 seconds, you're a criminal. We got to shut you up. We've got to lie about you, as they do regularly in the main media. But you're not allowed to talk because rationality is not permitted. This is a level of hysteria I have never seen, even during the Second World War, which I'm old enough to remember very well. Well, net result, the US continues as before to block any form of diplomatic settlement. Could there be a diplomatic settlement? We don't know. You can't know unless you try. That's elementary. If you refuse to try, can't be a diplomatic settlement. So let's go on sacrificing Ukrainians, because maybe because it makes us feel good, or maybe because we think we're noble and heroic. We're not. It's nothing noble and heroic about saying, let's kill as many Ukrainians as possible until they get devastated. Meanwhile, I'm standing up high on principle. And you look at the people who are holding up the principle, it's shocking. You take the Atlantic Council, the major internationally oriented organization. Its leading figures are standing up very high on principle. We can't allow Russia to get away with this. Nobody's allowed to get away with any international crimes. The same people are enthusiastic supporters of the US invasion of Iraq. You can't call it hypocrisy. It's beyond any word I know in the English language. And that's not only accepted, but respected. We've reached a level of corruption, moral corruption, intellectual corruption, where things like this are actually respected. Well, it's pretty clear what they mean. I should say, if you want to know the official US position, the most recent exposition of it was at the Ramstein Air Base a couple of weeks ago. The US called together the NATO powers, some others, to meet at the US Air Base, Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where it basically laid down the orders. The orders were keep fighting until Russia is severely harmed, so much so that it cannot carry out such acts again. That means harm Russia more than Germany was harmed at the Versailles Treaty, more than that, because that didn't eliminate their possibility of future aggression. What does that mean? Turn Russia into an agricultural peasant country? What's it supposed to mean? Whatever it means, for Ukrainians, it means keep dying, because we want to harm Russia for our own reasons. In fact, it's sometimes called the Afghan model, referring to the 1980s, where the US essentially tried to prolong the war, undermine negotiations, so as to kill as many Russians as possible. The architect of this proposal, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, was asked at the end, did he think it was a successful policy? He said, of course it was successful. It left, he said, some agitated Muslims, his phrase. Yes, there were some agitated Muslims, but look how we weakened Russia. 1,000,000 cadavers, but it's just a bunch of agitated Muslims. Who cares about that? That's Carter's national security advisor. That's called the left in the United States, not the right. Well, let's face reality. That's the model that's being proposed, sometimes explicitly, like by Hillary Clinton, not the right wing. Plenty of people in Congress. Okay, so there'll be some agitated Muslims, but who cares, these time agitated Ukrainians.
Thank you for that, Professor Chomsky. If we are to go back to Palestine, particularly to the events of May 2021.
Is this question number 4? No.
This is question number 4.
Number 4.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
So the events of May 2021 and May 2022 signaled a shift in the nature of the Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian people seem to be more united and more invested in creating a different superstructure, if you will, that is free from factionalism and political rivalry. Part of that change is taking place in the form of the language that is being used by resisting Palestinian communities throughout historic Palestine, not just the West Bank and Gaza. Regarding the issue of language, How is it essential? Is it as a condition to the creation of new forms of collective awareness and new framing of the Palestinian struggle that is free from self serving factionalism, but one that is also liberated from the US imposed language that accompanied the Oslo Accords, the so called peace process, and the subsequent Oslo political culture?
Just to make sure we're on the same page, was that question number 4?
Yes, sir, it is
The
question
one
number
that
4.
starts the events of May 2021?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It is.
Well, I think that's a very positive change. For one thing that has severely impeded the Palestinian struggle is the conflict between Hamas and the PLO. If that's not resolved, it's a great gift to Israel. Also, the split between the legal boundaries of Israel within its legal boundaries and the expanded area of Greater Palestine. Basically, it's a good thing that that's turning into the same struggle. Palestinians are all in it together. Actually, the B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch description of the whole region as a region of apartheid, though I don't entirely agree with it for the reasons I mentioned. I think it's not harsh enough, but nevertheless, it's a step towards recognizing that there's something crucially in common between in all this area. So I think that's a positive step, but it should be taken with clear understanding of what is happening. We should not be deluded into thinking that Israel is that events are developing towards a one-state outcome or towards a confederation, as is now being discussed by some of the Israeli left. It's not moving in that direction. That's not even an option for now. Israel will never accept it as long as it has the option of greater Israel with no demographic. Is going to consider anything else. And furthermore, there's no support for it in the international community. None. Not even the African states who are jealous of sovereignty. They're not going to support the elimination of some sovereign state anywhere. It's not to their interest. They're concerned about their own sovereignty, rightfully, in an area of, after all, European, now US Western colonialism hasn't ended. It's alive and well, and they know that. So they're not going to accept it. Certainly Europe's not, and nobody is. So that's just a dead end. 2 states, well, we can talk about it, but so you have to recognize that we have to struggle against the ongoing live option of a greater Israel. Within that, it's wise and promising for Palestinians to recognize we're all in it together, and that includes the diaspora communities. Yes, it's a common struggle. You go to, I mean, you know much better than I do, but I've visited refugee camps in Lebanon. It's a horrifying experience. You go to even the camps in Beirut, which are the better ones, like Sabra Shatila, it's not the worst. You see little children playing in the dirt. They're never going to see the sunlight. Parents invite you into their homes, actually small apartments, and they lovingly show you the key to the village in Galilee from which they were brutally expelled, hoping somehow to get back. It's painful. It's very painful to see and much more painful to live, of course. Lebanon won't allow them into the society. Israel bombs when it feels like or kills anybody it wants. Well, that's part of a couple of million people who are a major part of the Palestinian problem. Okay, so they should be together, working together. We should be giving them whatever kind of help we can give from the outside. And in the United States, the main help we can give them is, and I think it's significant help, is to change US policy. There is now a substantial base of popular support for a significant change in US policy, even up to threatening to withdraw all military and economic aid, which can well be regarded as illegal under US law. That's an opening. Okay, let's press it. Many things rest on it, like the Iran issue. Serious issue. Americans wouldn't like it if they knew that the threat of global war over Iran is caused by the need to violate US law to protect Israeli nuclear installations. If Americans knew that, they wouldn't like it. Well, okay, let's press on that, on other things like it. I think that can lead to a change. And for people in my position, say in the United States, there's really nothing else to do except try to publicize, make public what's the crimes that are going on in the West Bank and Gaza, even worse, Golan Heights as well, and the repression in Israel and the horrible situation of the refugees. Can try to make it public, but policy changes could happen in the United States, and that would be decisive.
Thank you. If I may bring my co-host Romana back to the studio again.
Yes, Professor Chomsky, international solidarity with Palestine seems to be growing too. And occasionally, the discussion on Palestine even goes mainstream as a result, for example, of mainstream celebrities and well-known figures expressing their support for the Palestinian struggle and freedom. Much of this, of course, can be attributed to the determination of the Palestinian people, or in negative to the cruelty of the Israeli occupation, but also to the growing clout of the BDS movement. So what is your take on this? And how can Palestinians utilize this international solidarity in their fight for freedom, despite the fact that they still do not have a centralized or unified political message due to the crisis of their leadership, but they have as a people a vision for liberation, as Professor Ilan Pape and Dr. Ramzy Baroud call it in their latest book, Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. So what is your take on this, on international solidarity and how Palestinians can utilize it?
I'm sorry, but I don't see which question, which of the questions?
Number 5.
5? Oh, question 5. Okay. Well, I don't think mainstream celebrities matter that much. What matters is what's happening among the general population. In the United States, it's quite different. In Israel, unfortunately, the population is moving to the right. It's one of the few countries I know, maybe the only one, where younger people are more reactionary than older ones. Older people have sometimes some kind of memory of the aspirations to be a somewhat humane, maybe even social democratic society, fading a long time ago. Younger people have no experience with that. Most young people don't even know there's a green line. You have an nice apartment in occupied Jaffa. You want to visit your cousin in Ma'ale Adumim. You drive on a superhighway for Jews and visitors only. You get to the center of the West Bank in Ma'ale Adumim, you visit your cousin who lives in a very nice suburban, highly subsidized villa. You don't even know there's an Arab anywhere. You're right in the middle of the West Bank. Okay, that's life for a young Israeli. So yes, of course, they're going way to the right. They feel aggrieved. Liberals don't like them anymore. Okay, let's turn to the right. Let's make our alliances with the more reactionary, brutal states and feel aggrieved. That's Israel now. By now, the majority of the population thinks there shouldn't be any Arabs anywhere near the government in Israel. Well, that's happening in the United States. In Israel, the United States going the opposite direction. Young people are more and more critical of Israel, more and more supportive of Palestinian rights. Well, as far as the BDS movement is concerned, it has a mixed record. Insofar as it's focused on the occupation, it's very productive. When it turns to things like, it has a kind of fixed, rigid program. And I've dealt with national liberation movements all my life. This is the first one I've seen that is so rigid, it cannot discuss tactical questions, which are the most important questions. What's the effect going to be of this action? You can't discuss that because there's a rigid program which we have to follow. That's often very harmful. It's harming Palestinians. What it does is divert attention away from the problems of Palestinians to side questions, academic freedom, anti-Semitism, and so on. And take a look at the Washington Post this morning. Long article by one of their liberal columnists on how the BDS movement is moving to strict anti-Semitism. And it discusses a program of one group in Boston, which is actually poorly designed. But you can't talk about it because it's rigid. Have this program, have to stick to it. But what I was talking about before, the Leahy law, it's not in the rigid formula, so they don't do it. Well, missing opportunities. So that's a mixed story, I think. Has to become more flexible, more thoughtful about the effects of actions. Every solidarity movement understands that. This is the first one I've ever dealt with that refuses to talk about it. That's harmful. But nevertheless, it's getting through. So the assassination of Shirin Abu Akleh, for example, made it to mainstream television. Also the brazen attack on the funeral, and it caused plenty of outrage among the general population. It's impossible to suppress completely what's happening, and we can do more to bring it forward and to leading to policies that will change things here in true solidarity with the Palestinians in Israel, in the occupied territories, in the diaspora, all working together, basically common aims, have to find the right way to select policies and tactics that will advance these aims. Now, the groundwork is there. It's necessary to think carefully about how to carry it forward. There's plenty of barriers. Like take, for example, this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, international, I forget what they're called, IHRA. It's all over the place. Well, the right response to that, I think, is to applaud it. Say, yeah, that's a great definition of anti-Semitism. Using that definition, we can instantly show that the Israeli Supreme Court is radically anti-Semitic. Easy to show that by their definition. And one of their planks in the program is that people who try to identify Jews all over the world with the state of Israel are anti-Semites. Okay, Supreme Court of Israel. Israel is, I'm quoting, the sovereign state of the Jewish people. Prime candidate for anti-Semitism. Or take the distinguished statesman Abba Eban, greatly revered because of his nice English accent and gentlemanly demeanor and so on. Okay, wrote an article 50 years ago, published in the liberal American Jewish Journal, Jewish Congress, Congress Weekly, you can find it, in which he instructed Americans that their task is, American Jews, addressed to them, said your task is to show that all criticisms of Zionism are either anti-Semitic, if they come from non-Jews, or are the result of neurotic self-hatred, if they come from Jews. So 100% of criticism is banned because the Jews cannot be distinguished from support for Israel. That's pure anti-Semitism according to the IHRA definition. So fine, let's accept the definition and bring out its consequences. Incidentally, I should say that one of the things I like to mention on my CV that I'm proud of is that among the Jews who criticize Israel because of neurotic Jewish self-hatred, I'm one. He mentioned two, me and I.F. Stone, both of us consumed by neurotic guilt feelings. That's why we criticize his government. Okay, fine, let's bring it to the public. Well, I think there are lots of things we can do. We can bring out the cynicism, pure cynicism of these claims of anti-Semitism and take a look at what they actually mean and the policies that are used to try to beat people into submission. Take, say, the British Labour Party, or what's called the Labour Party. It has almost nothing to do with labor anymore. The Labour Party, Keith Starmer's party, just extravagantly celebrated their renewal of relations with the Israeli Labour Party, tiny, diminishing party, which is on the far right, but it can now be rejoined with the Labour Party, Starmer's party, because they got rid of Jeremy Corbyn for having to be semi-reasonable and to try to create a Labour Party that would in fact respond to its own constituents and their needs. No, it's supposed to be run by a right-wing elite in Parliament, the Blairite, soft Thatcherites. Okay, let's bring that out. Let's bring out the historical lying campaign about anti-Semitism that was wielded to destroy Corbyn. Fine, let's talk about it. Let's expose it and see what's happening to these corrupt institutions like the former Labour Party. Create an alternative, change our own societies, bring this together with the problem of the Palestinians, which is real, which we can help with. Lots of opportunities are open, and I think we can think about them and exploit them.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, and I promise this is our last question. I know we have exceeded our allocated time, but this is a very, very important question, and we would like to finish with that. So it will be question number 6. And the question is, throughout the years, there have been many heated debates regarding the proper solution for Palestine. At one point, the PLO itself, that's back in the 60s, championed a one-state solution only to abandon it in favor of the two-state solution. And now we are back to the one-state solution debate. Now that the two-state solution has become in many ways defunct. Of course, there are other solutions that are often discussed, including, for example, a rights-based solution. How do you feel about the issue of offering solutions at this stage of the Palestinian struggle? And does such a thing make the discussion purely academic and intellectual exercise, thus removed from the fight for liberation in Palestine itself?
In an academic seminar, I would be all in favor of rights-based solutions to everything, to radical economic inequality, to the growing threat of nuclear war, to repression in Egypt, to kleptocracy in Russia, go around the world, all in favor of it. Has nothing to do with anyone's problems. I would prefer, and I think we should prefer, to focus on what we can do to help suffering people overcome misery everywhere. That's what we should be focusing on. There's plenty of problems. Take Afghanistan. According to the latest UN report, 20 million people, 20 million are facing imminent starvation in Afghanistan. One major reason is the United States has stolen the money of the Afghan government. It's stuck in New York banks. Not giving it back to them because we have to punish them for having thrown out the United States. That's what it comes. They don't say that, of course, but that's what it is. The pretexts that are given make it even worse. The pretext is we have to keep it in New York banks because maybe Americans will want to be compensated for 9/11, for which the Afghan people had nothing to do with. But we've got to make sure that if some American says, I want to be compensated, 20 million Afghans have to starve. Okay, let's talk about that and do something about it, because that one's easy. We can release the funds. We can offer them massive compensation for the destruction that we carried out against that society for 20 years. And in fact, going way back to the lovely Afghan trap back in the 1980s, for which we have plenty of responsibility. In fact, take it with pride, as Brzezinski does. Well, that's one case. Case of Palestine, case of Yemen. You can go around the world. Any number of things we can do. So let's concentrate on that. As far as Palestine is concerned, same thing. We can talk about a rights-based solution, but there is no possible way to implement it. So why talk about it? I mean, yes, it's nice to have in mind. It's a nice ideal. Peace on earth is a nice ideal. Let's talk about that. But let's concentrate on what we can do. What we can do begins with the existing situation. You want to do something decent in the world? You ask, what's happening now? What can I do about it? What are my long-term goals? Long-term goals could be a rights-based solution. But what do we do now to move towards that? Well, now we're back to where I was talking about before. The situation now is a 50-year program still underway to establish a greater Israel. It's perfectly clear, perfectly explicit. Travel on the ground. You've done a lot more than I have. Don't have to tell you. But you travel on the ground, you see it. You see the 160 or so enclaves. You see the daily settler attacks. I've been in Gaza. You see the misery and violence there regularly. It's right on the headlines. Masayariyatas right there now. Drive 1,000 Palestinians out of their homes so Jewish settlers can move in under the fraudulent pretext of a military firing zone. Totally fraudulent, the one that's used all the time. That's what's happening now. Let's do something about that, okay? And we can. Is a two-state solution dead? I don't think so. In fact, if US policy changes and the United States insists that Israel withdraw the IDF from the West Bank, they're going to have to do it. They have no choice. Just as when George W. Bush, very strongly pro-Israel, when he ordered Israel to stop programs with China upgrading advanced military equipment, they hated it. That's their main hope for economic development, high-tech military. China's a huge market. They said they're never going to stop no matter what happens. Bush told them, you're going to stop? They stopped. They've got to. Don't have any choices. US tells them, pull the IDF out of the West Bank, goes. Incidentally, there's no need to withdraw the settlers. That's a non-issue. Settlers want to stay in a Palestinian state, fine. They're not going to want to. They're going to want to leave. 90% of them, 95%, are going to leave their highly subsidized pleasant villas in the West Bank, move to highly subsidized. Some, like some hilltop settler youth from Brooklyn who are going to stay no matter what. Okay, let them stay. I don't think of these as really serious issues. It's it's a problem, but a problem that can be dealt with. The crucial question is the United States going to move to the point where it will join the world, in fact, entire world, in supporting a settlement basically on the Green Line with some modifications, basic structures clear. It's come pretty close to that. The Taba negotiations in January 2001, according to participants on both sides, said that we're coming fairly close to a possible settlement when they were canceled by Ehud Barak, canceled the discussions. So maybe the Geneva negotiations afterwards in informal discussions, but fairly high level, they came out with some feasible programs. Israel dismissed them, wouldn't even talk about them. The United States totally disregarded them, didn't even mention their existence. That could change.
Professor Chomsky, you have been very kind and generous with your time, and we have exceeded the allocated hour by about 15 minutes. We appreciate your patience, but we also appreciate everything that you have done to raise awareness about the situation in Palestine, but many other situations of oppression and human rights violations around the world. Thank you for all of that, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I'm going to bring my co-host Romana here as well. Thank you very much for all of this, and thank you for all of the our readers who tuned in to listen to us. Please share this conversation, spread the word widely on this, and we are going to be sharing it more in the form of a written feature very, very soon. Thank you very much, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. My pleasure. Very good to have a chance to talk to you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.